This presentation, titled Are You Ready for an FDA FSMA Audit?, comes to us from Gina M. Gina is president of Quality Assurance Strategies, LLC, a private consultancy for the food and beverage industry specializing in global food safety and quality, with expertise in regulatory compliance, Prop 65, crisis management, and business integration. She was formerly vice president, food safety for Weston Foods, a GWL Canadian company and North American leader in bakery products. Gina has more than 35 years of food safety and quality experience, having held successive senior positions with Colgate-Palmolive, Coca-Cola, Best Foods NA, Unilever, Yum Brands, and Quiznos. Prior to joining Weston Foods, she held the position of quality director with Mondelez International, formerly Kraft Foods, in Europe, and Cadbury as QA Chocolate Director, Quality, Environmental, and Health and Safety for North America, Europe, Global. And with that, take it away, Gina.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So today, everybody, welcome. We're going to be covering, are you ready for the FDA FSMA Audit, which is the new Food Safety Modernization Act that was enacted by the FDA back in 2016. So quickly today for the agenda, we're going to be covering the background and overview of FSMA, how it came about. We're going to go through the inspection basics and who's targeted through the inspections by the FDA. We're going to go through inspection authority, which has been enhanced under the new regulation, as well as I'm going to cover today just a brief hot topic today with the pandemic on temporary guidelines that the FDA has enacted because of the crisis that we're going through with the pandemic. So I'll cover a little bit about that as well. We're going to talk about their new enforcement, preparing for an inspection, the importance of documentation, sampling, and testing. We're going to go through a little bit of what I call the audit maze and the closing interview with the FDA investigators. FDA FSMA audit observations, the 483. This is the form number they assigned if you're cited with a violation. So we'll cover a little bit about that as well. As a closing, we're going to go through the essentials for a successful audit as you take on ownership going forward yourself. So expectations for today, we're going to cover the FDA's Food Safety Modernization Act as the game changer in the regulatory arena for FDA. We're going to talk about how the new audit authority is now in place, and folks need to be ready today 24/7. Years ago, the FDA may show up at your door. It was generally during normal business hours. Today, they can show up anytime, day or night in your facility, so you have to be prepared. FSMA is about prevention, putting onus on the manufacturers and food processors to identify risk in your food portfolio and to mitigate those hazards to prevent foodborne illness. We're going to go through some do's and don'ts through the audit process, as well as creating your own playbook, which is known today as the Food Safety Plan under the new FSMA regulation. And it's critical for constructive audit, and you will be cited if your food safety plan does not meet the expectations of the FDA. We're also going to cover audit insights and inspection enforcement and where they're focused today for their new audits going forward for 2020. So a little bit about pre-FSMA, what the arena looked like in the old food safety industry under the old regulations. We had come to a point in the industry where we were generalizing the requirements for inspection and compliance in what they called good manufacturing practices, the GMPs, for regulatory compliance. But things started to go awry. We had a large increase overnight in many recalls in the food industry. They were becoming broader in scope because of global supply chains today. There was heightened awareness from consumers. Media was almost instantaneous, although this was pre-social media. We were finding that if something went wrong in a food organization, it was on the 6 o'clock news, and there were dozens and dozens of recalls cited generally when this happened. Civil and criminal penalties started being seen for enforcement in this area because it had gotten so out of hand, as well as a lot of bankruptcies with food organizations that couldn't afford to mitigate or manage their recalls. and company brands were at risk as well as reputation from these organizations. So pre-FSMA, a lot of what we've seen was reactive. Regulatory were not preventative in those days, and it became an issue to ensure that your food systems were providing the best adherences, if you will, to the regulations to mitigate any risk or foodborne disease. Inspection frequency was all over the map. Generally, it could be 2 to 3 years, but there was no guarantee if the FDA came through in that frequency. So you might have years between inspections, and any mitigation that you may have had to put in place really went by the wayside because so many things could change in a manufacturing organization. It was more focused on physical appearance of your facility rather than targeting the food risks themselves. And record access by the inspections was generally very limited and protected under the old regulations. So FSMA came about really through years of looking at the regulations, understanding what the gaps were, and talking to industry and academia and experts to see how they can improve on the system and move the risk reviews to more of a preventative control rather than an after-the-fact situation. So it began in 2000, in the late 2000s, and the regulations started kicking in for review by industry 2015. It was intended to ensure safe manufacturing practices and consumption for consumers. And one of the things that is the premier piece, if you will, of the new regulations is the preventative controls aspect of the food safety regulations. And the preventative controls for human food rule eventually became effective on September 10th in 2016. Top line view, it focuses more on being proactive than reactive, focusing on risks. It gives the FDA more authority today as far as recalls, detentions, fines, and shutting down facilities if need be, revoking registration and license plates for the facilities. The industry requirements focuses more on inspections, record keeping, and imports that come into the U.S. For the American consumer. Little bit of the top line requirements. Many of us in the food industry are familiar with HACCP, the Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. Under the new regulation, they've deemed that to be called the Hazard Analysis and Risk-Based Preventative Controls, or the HARP-C. That is the gist of the food safety plan. So it's one and the same. And this is what the FDA investigators or inspectors will focus on when they come into your facility to ensure you're preventing hazards in your portfolio. The updated good manufacturing practices have also been enhanced, as well as adding a requirement for a preventative controls qualified individual, PCQI. This is a person that has to be certified in your facility to manage your food safety plan and sign off on documentation. It has to be done through an approved accreditation program through the FDA, and there are many organizations that provide that training, but you have to have at least one person on site in your facility that is a certified PCQI now under the new regulations. And basically everybody that's producing food for the US is covered with a few exceptions. And generally anything under the FDA Food and Drug Cosmetics Act is applicable, as well as domestic and imported foods for the U.S. Impact on inspections with the new regulations. It's really focused on high-risk foods and facilities with emphasis on your systems and your documentation. Previously, it was a snapshot in time. Now it's a more intense review of your systems. There is increased record access, which I mentioned, the food safety plan. There has to be monitoring and verification records provided to the FDA, as well as validation of your kill step, your run times, your sanitation frequency, and any other critical systems in your facility. And there's also more focus on environmental and product swabs or sampling in the facility today. And when this first kicked in, the industry was kind of in a state of shock because they would come in and do these intense swabbing regimes, 200-300 samples in your facility, especially if they saw something that may be at risk, which we lovingly call in the industry the swabathons. And they have not moved away from this. So this is something you need to be aware of today. Regulatory inspection frequency and requirements. Under the new regulation, they kicked in 2016. And if you're a domestic facility with relatively high risk, it's about every 3 years. If it's less than that for a risk scenario, you would be inspected about every 5 years. However, again, if something came up in the industry, you could be red flagged, such as a recall in a product category or complaints in your facility. You may get an inspection much sooner. Excuse me. There is enhanced enforcement authority today. They have the right to detain your food products if there's reason to believe the products could be misbranded or adulterated. Could be on hold for about 20 days, but that's subject to investigation. You could be forced to do a mandatory recall, although it's highly recommended that you do a voluntary with your organization. Suspension of registration also can be carried out by the FDA, as well as some other fines and other fees that they can attach as well if there's a serious hazard. A little bit about the temporary pandemic policy guidance that the FDA has issued. And again, this came about most recently because travel for inspectors or investigators has really been put on hold, not only across the United States, but also for our partners abroad. So if something comes up for your visit, for your interval, if you come up for an inspection, unless there's something very dire going on in your facility, it has been put on hold as a temporary measure until things get back to normal. If there is an issue that crops up with a recall or a commodity issue within the industry, you still may get an issue as it becomes a cause situation. So they may come out a little bit sooner and do something, but because of the pandemic, the FDA is providing notification to facilities today, which they've not done in the past. They used to just knock on your door and show up. They tried to make accommodation today because of the pandemic to alleviate that need for safe screening of visitors because of the pandemic situation. So they will most likely try to contact the organization in advance if they have to come in and visit. And it's usually just a critical basis that they will come into your facility today. There's also something called the Food Safety Verification Program for foreign suppliers. And this is an agreement between organizations to have their products or commodities approved in advance before coming to the US without any glitches. And they have to meet the new regulations. That program has also been suspended overseas. And again, unless there's cause, they will unlikely continue those visits, and they will rely on the importer for certification of those products. There is a certifying group that's approved by the FDA to do these audits in advance for periodic review. If they're able to travel to these countries to do that audit, it's allowed as an alternative. But the FDA has put this on hold and suspended the program at least temporarily until further notice. We're going to get into the inspections themselves now. And it is something that, again, the FDA focuses on risk in your portfolio. They identify what are the high-risk food facilities, both domestic and imported. They look at state, local, and provincial government working in partners with them to sometimes substitute audits. And because some of these authorities may have broader authority than the FDA, say, for example, provincial in Canada, they have provincial audits. they may have broader scope and be able to dig deeper into your records or your systems than the FDA. A high-risk facility deemed under the FDA, there's actually a program that they use called Predict with algorithms to figure out who may be in this high-risk category, but there's other criteria that feed into that as well. If there is a facility that has come under fire or red flag for a particular recall or food safety risk or foodborne illness or complaints, that would also raise the risk factors and put you on a more frequent basis. The picture here illustrates Peanut Corporation of America, which was a huge recall situation several years back, triggering a lot of recalls across the country with peanut or peanut material from Peanut Corporation of America for salmonella foodborne poisoning. And that company eventually went out of business, and several of the officials in the organization had gone to jail. There are 6 high-risk factors that they look at. Just to give you a little background, besides the criteria I mentioned already, the compliance history of the organization, the effectiveness of your hazard analysis and your risk-based preventative controls, whether the imported food meets certain criteria as a priority under their regulations, whether the imported food complies with FSMA in their import program, and again, other necessary criteria, which again, could be the flags they put in their Predict system. So what do you do when the FDA comes knocking at your door? Are you ready as an organization to allow that person to come in and perform his robust inspection of your facility? So there are 10 general components for an inspection. Obviously, it's preparing for that inspection, conducting the initial interviews, determining the steps for a walkthrough of your facility, evaluating the sanitary conditions of your facility, conducting your hazard analysis, evaluate your food safety plan, your implementation of the plan, your records review, inspection findings, and documentation inspection findings. So these are the 10 focal points that the FDA will examine when they come through your facility. And if you don't have these criteria available and able to answer questions, you could find yourself with getting citations from the FDA. The best way to be prepared for this, because they will conduct their own inspections of even your own systems, is to have your own policy in place before they walk in the door that covers all your regulatory inspection criteria. And they follow a manual called the Investigator's Operation Manual, which you can see illustrated on the right. It was updated in 2017. However, this is their Bible, their guidebook that they follow. So for you as an organization, you should have a policy in place so you can show that to the investigator if something comes up that may be in conflict with what they want to see in your facility. So you need to designate who's in charge in your audit review, your key documents that would be available for the inspectors, your policy against photographs or video in your facility, if that's your company's policy, describing your policy for companion or split samples, swabs, and sampling in your facility if they take some of those while they're on site, your requirement for receipts from the inspectors, as well as what can be signed and won't be signed by the personnel in your facility. And it's a good recommendation never to sign an affidavit with any of your employees while the inspectors are on site, because it could hold your company accountable. So what do you do when an inspector shows up at your door? You need to have your receptionists or your frontline employees trained and ready to receive an inspector. And they need to welcome the individual or individuals. Usually there's several when they show up at your facility, and to be able to notify plant management immediately. You need to verify their documents and make sure they're who they represent. It's a good idea to make copies of those documents. You do not want to leave the inspectors waiting very long or unattended. So you generally want to have a room ready where you can move them to a holding area or a conference room where they can be given some time to set up and folks can gather to come in and receive them. You want to make sure they review your visitor policy as well as covering your GMPs and health and safety requirements for your facility. And generally plants today have visitors sign off on that. The FDA inspectors or investigators will not sign off on your documentation. They are not allowed to do that. And I strongly urge, because I've heard of this happening, do not refuse them entry into your facility. Simply make a note to file that the inspectors were shown the policy and did not want to sign it. You need to discuss the intent of the visit with the FDA. You want to understand the purpose of the visit. Is it there for a follow-up on a complaint? Is there a commodity recall going on in the industry? Or is it just your annual regular visit or a couple of year visit? If the inspector states that the visit can extend more than 2 days, you need to set up an agenda and facilitate the walkthrough and the visitation of your facility. You need to designate and also in advance have trained escorts to accompany the FDA investigators. And this is usually led by the PCQI, the trained certified person to work with the FDA. And you don't want to allow any of the inspection team to wander off or leave your escort route in your facility for their safekeeping and to make sure that everybody stays in designated areas. So you always want to be sure to accompany the investigators, direct all questions to select people that are escorting the FDA. You want to make sure that you're knowledgeable to answer questions. And if you don't have the answers, see if you can find them out by the persons that are responsible, or do not be afraid to say that you do not have those answers and you'll have to follow up. You want to make sure somebody is taking detailed notes during this inspection. It's usually prescribed to have one designated person to do all the note taking as a scribe during the entire visit. You want to decide which of the employees can interact with the investigators. This might have to be done in advance to clear with union officials as well, or supervisors on the floor. So you want to make sure that's all cleared in advance. You want to make a detailed list of copies of all the documents that they review or any photos taken. You want to keep track of items that need follow-up, record complete descriptions of any product or finished samples that they take. You want to make sure that any of the process materials collected during the inspection are sampled by your group as well at the same time to duplicate those samples. You want to coordinate environmental swabbing efforts if that goes on. They should tell you in advance. And if it's done on a back shift, you need to make sure you have the proper personnel to cover that with the FDA. It's usually done on a back shift after a sanitation. And they could take between 200 and 300 samples when they swab. So you want to make sure you have enough materials on hand and the personnel to cover that at the same time. You might need to seek counsel or legal information from your department on sensitive material, or check with your senior leadership on any questions of company policy. And you want to make sure that all the sample materials, if it impacts your product from shipping with the inspectors taking finished product or zone 1 sampling, which is direct product contact, to go on hold pending their investigative results or the swab or sampling results coming back that they are negative. Records are a big piece of what they're going to be looking at. You want to make sure that if there's proprietary information, you discuss that in advance with them and make sure you get clearance if something needs to be seen, if they insist on that. But if it's proprietary, they should not be pressing the issue to see that, such as certain formulas might be proprietary in your organization. You want to make sure that your record retention program complies with the 2002 Bioterrorism Act and FSMA requirements so that you're meeting the policy record keeping information should they question that. You don't want to produce electronic copies if you can, you want to make copies of the things that you share with them, and that the records are more confidential so they cannot forward those records. You want to make sure that if you have labels or packaging, which is in plain sight, or they collect any of that, that you make sure it's compliant as well, because you could receive a warning letter after the fact when they leave your facility. So a little bit more deeper into records and access to those records. Again, they have enhanced inspection capability today with record keeping. And they will want to see your registration number, movement of any interstate commerce, such as bills of lading or transportation records or invoices. They may ask for product labeling and packaging. They may ask for your mock recall records or consumer complaints or client complaints. They will want to review in detail your food safety plan, which is your risk preventative controls program that you reviewed. Anything within full view of the tour of your facility is fair game to them, as well as documents that may be pertaining to your food products to ensure that it's mitigated from any health risk or hazards. They could demand to see certain records that are unusual, but generally it's pretty straightforward. And anything that is reasonably believed to affect the safety of those products, they may want to request and see as well. And consumers and customer complaints, as I mentioned, that might be something else that they want to see as a result of your visit through the facility. They may see something that's flagged and want to see anything that's pertaining to that. The HARP-C record access is definitely something that falls under FSMA for them to review in detail. And they want to look at that because they want to understand your validation and verification of your risk mitigation programs. So the food safety plan, along with all the documentation that went into your assessment of the risk, is something that they're going to want to look at in great detail. And what is the difference between validation and verification? Because this question comes up quite a bit. So validation is the process that demonstrates your food safety plan is effective and is controlling the hazards in your process. So typical processes or systems that you would have for validation is your kill step validation, your runtime frequency, allergen validations of your product, environmental monitoring programs, challenge studies of your program, sanitation records that ensure that your sanitation frequency and chemicals are effective. And all of these pertinent documents have to be signed off on a 7-day basis, so a weekly basis, by your PCQI before your products are released. So they're going to want to know that that's happening and your program is robust. Verification are simply the processes that go through your process or your manufacturing lines on a routine basis. So this is something that identifies a step in your process and it's checked off and it's working properly. Typical examples of this are your metal detector checks, signing off by your sanitation team, time, temperature, color checks, calibration studies that are done in your facility by maintenance, reanalysis of your processes for validation have to be completed every 3 years at minimum, or if something severely changes in your process or your manufacturing. Other critical records, just to give you an idea of some of the things they may ask for, your hazard analysis or your critical control points, your preventative controls, supplier records, COAs, environmental monitoring, training records, corrective and preventative actions, run times, challenge studies, shelf life studies, supply chain program verification work that you have done, your recall or your mock recall programs, third-party audits, consumer complaints, sanitary transport procedures, which is a new requirement under FSMA, and your food defense plan. Basically, if it's not documented, the FDA will assume it's not being completed. That's been kind of the practice for years. However, today with FSMA, they're asking for more specific information to your site, such as the facility address, needs to have the times and who signed off, their role and responsibility, and they will accept electronic verification signatures and records today. So that's something that's been added. Some other recommended watch-outs. Investigators are looking for weaknesses in your facility. So your plans need to be robust, your policies and everything you're saying you're doing in your process, such as your SSOPs or your SOPs of your facility, your standard operating procedures or sanitation operating procedures, they have to be all aligned and show evidence of your process is working effectively. So paper trails for sanitation, training records, CCPs, kill steps, shelf life, corrective and preventative action. All of these are something that they're going to want to go through, as well as risk mitigation programs for cross-contact in your facility for allergens, your zoning and how you classify your environmental monitoring, your trafficking patterns, foreign material removal systems, allergen and pathogen prevention, as well as review of your high-risk ingredients in your facility and calibration records, pest control, food defense, and food fraud. If you have records that are turned over to the FDA, you want to make sure they're labeled as sensitive records. Otherwise, they could be exposed under the Freedom of Information Act and made public in their write-up of your facility audit. So you want to make sure that each document is signed with a policy compliance stamp of some sort or something approved by your legal department to protect the confidentiality of those records and also protect you if you have trade secrets or proprietary information. The sample of that is shown here. Photos and video inspection of your facility. Under the old GMP rules, they were not allowed to do this, although they insisted quite often to do this and made a habit of pressing for these photos. With their new inspection manual, they are told they are allowed to take photos. So you can go back and forth with your legal team, but at the end of the day, they will be taking photos of your facility. So it's a good idea to limit the photos to a specific point in a line, not to take photos of employees if at all possible. And also if you have a person that has a good camera or has a phone, smartphone that can take pictures, highly recommended to duplicate those same photos that they're taking with your own evidence. Again, it's not likely you're going to be able to refuse them, excuse me, the opportunity to take photos. You can firmly refuse very politely, show your policy. But at the end of the day, you're most likely going to have to take companion photos, and you can request copies of the photos and certainly contact your counsel if need be. Now getting into swabbing during the inspections. They have increased authority today, and any samples and swabs they will take of your facility, they have to issue what's called a Form 484. It's a receipt for anything that they take in your facility. It's highly recommended to take companion or split samples of everything the investigator samples as well. And the reason for that is it could be weeks before you get information back on their swabbing and sampling. And you may have product that's on hold, and you want to know the answers to those products for pathogen testing in case before the FDA comes back to you. So it's a good practice to do duplication sampling. And they have to provide a written report on any samples that they take, especially if they analyze for evidence of being adulterated, which could be a foodborne illness. They routinely take swabs now. Generally, it's not a lot because the initial swabathons have mostly, moved to more routine audits. However, we do hear stories that they are still coming through and taking 100 to 200, 300 samples on back shifts especially. They do go through a swabbing compilation that goes into a database today. It used to be PulseNet, but now there are many different agencies they collaborate with on a worldwide basis, not only in the US. And they feed these samples into a database and look for sequencing that matches with other samples in the system or previous foodborne illnesses. So whole genome sequencing is what they're moving to today. And the old PFGE has really gone the wayside. And the whole genome sequencing is what they look at today. And they can tell a piece of a fingerprint in a sample and link it up to something that is years previous. The Bluebell ice cream situation, they link back to foodborne illnesses all the way back to 2012, so years prior. And once it's in the database, it will be there forever. So something to keep in mind if they're swabbing or sampling in your facility. Some watch-outs with this. Again, if you're prepared and set up in advance with the personnel and the swabbing samples to do this in advance, you will be much better off. You want to make sure you take notes. Preferably, you want to map where the sampling was taken so that any possible routes or pathogen history can be correlated later at when you review the map and the trafficking patterns in the facility and the cleaning records. And you want to make sure that you, again, put all that product on hold, which is a good practice to do for product sampling and also Zone 1 samples. Additional programs that they will get into, supply chain risk controls are now part of FSMA with an in-depth review of your supply chain base and where you're pulling your products from as far as your commodities and your ingredients. And they want to understand that you as a manufacturer are controlling one level down your supplier systems and looking at the risk in their operations as well. You have to include a review to approve these suppliers, determining the conduct and documentation of their actions and systems. So if they're good suppliers, if they have problems, are you keeping records? Are you holding them accountable? Do they do on-site audits by third party? Do you have to do them? Are they sending in routine samples or providing other relative records, relevant records for your review? And usually an on-site annual visit is required, whether it's by your organization or by a third party, but they want to ensure that you're mitigating those risks for your supply chain as well. And a world-class program today will also include Prop 65 review if you're doing business in the state of California. And that is simply looking at the chemicals and toxins, pesticides that may be in your products, and looking at that with your suppliers as well. So some of the world-class programs that large organizations are looking at or reviewing on a regular basis is your new supplier approval process, your supplier raw material testing program. So you're looking at that for pathogens and allergens and micro risks. Material monitoring program is your chemicals, your toxins, your mycotoxins that may be in the food product, and anything related to Prop 65 requirements to sell your products in the state of California. You want to look at the chemicals and the toxins, pesticides. Sensitive ingredient testing, again, this might be related to your pathogen testing, allergens. You want to make sure all of that is looked at on a regular basis, depending on the risk in that product. So if it's flour, raw flour, we know there's salmonella and E. coli today. Dairy products may be prone to other pathogens. Anything that may have a significant risk with specific pathogens has to be reviewed and looked at. Food fraud and adulteration programs are also required under FSMA today. So olive oil, honey, fish products, anything that may come under the possibility of food fraud. A lot of herbs and spices may fall under this. They want to ensure that you are reviewing this with your suppliers and have robust programs in place to mitigate any risk there. And the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, which is getting your suppliers overseas to work in advance to be cleared to come into the U.S. at their managing their programs abroad to meet FSMA requirements for the U.S. And what you need to expect when you're inspected by the FDA. Now, remember, the FDA inspectors that show up at your door, they have authority as investigators. They wear a badge, and they are really just another format of like a police authority or something along those lines. So it's not just an inspector that walks up to your door, it is an investigator. So they are there to investigate and identify risk in your facility. So you want to make sure that your employees are trained in advance to manage an interview or a walkthrough or understanding what the requirements are when the FDA is in your facility. And you want to train, retrain, and make sure they are competent to answer questions, not get nervous, and do what they need to do during an inspection by the FDA. You should review the required GMPs and SSOPs for your facility and make sure that your employees are adhering to those practices that you've identified as requirements in your own facility. You want to stage a mock inspection if need be and critique your employees' performance. You want to know in advance and have a good relationship with your state FDA inspectors and have good relationships with all of them. Some other reminders, you want to avoid commenting on FDA inspector observations as they go through your facility. If they've come up with a wrong observation or have questioned something that they may be confused about, you want to make sure you explain it as much as possible to ensure that they get what the requirement may be. But you need to ensure that if they are still confused or their takeaway is different, it may not change the outcome of their observation, but you can note it in your file. You want to make sure that your comments and questions are taken correctly, and again, that you're split sampling anything that may be required from the inspectors to take while they're on site and get the appropriate receipts. Any finished product should go on hold. You want to make sure that product sampling, again, is tested by a third-party lab, if at all possible, to ensure that your results are ready when the FDA results come back. And you want to make sure that during the closing conference, you take appropriate notes and that you ask plenty of questions if need be. You don't want to sign anything unless your policy approves it, and you want to make sure your legal department and management team approves of that. They may want to talk to inspectors or employees during your visit through the plant. And you want to make sure that's approved in advance as well, that you do not take people away from their line duties that may cause a safety hazard or take them away from their duties. So you want to make sure it's all authorized in advance, and if possible, ensure that there is no confusion by the employees and it's done in an appropriate and safe manner. And they may want to inspect that something is being done to watch their duties to make sure they're adhering to a policy correctly. So you want to make sure everybody's as calm as possible to walk through that with an investigator if need be. And if you can, by all means, please make sure a representative is there to accompany the individual. I mentioned before, you don't want to sign any affidavits. It's usually inadvisable. It creates company admission, and the employee can also bind the company. So you want to politely refuse. You want to reflect that it's in your policy that you're not allowed to do that. And if need be, you might need to get counsel involved. But a receipt for a 483 for samples is okay to sign. Post-inspection, handling the 483s. Now, this is if they cite a violation during your facility or notice a gap. And if you're having routine dialogue with the investigators during the entire visit, the chances for this being a surprise will be minimal. They may still write you up. They may still give you a violation, but it's something you can politely discuss and see if you can identify factors that would improve that situation or correct something immediately while they're on site so they note it in the file, or if need be, note it to your file if they cannot change it or refuse to change their mind on the gap. They will present you with the 483 if they see something that's inappropriate. The FDA will review that with you before they leave the facility. They're obligated to do that. Again, if the item can be corrected during the visit, you want to make sure they do that and correct that on the form. And if the 483 is issued, you need to formally respond to that as soon as possible. So what that means is if a corrective action is in disagreement, you want to respond to that with your legal counsel, reviewing it as soon as you can within a few days. I wouldn't go more than a couple of days on that one. Or for future ongoing actions that need time to correct or capital to correct, if it's something very large, you want to make sure you respond in a timely fashion. And generally, that's a week to 2 weeks with a response on what you've identified as your corrective actions and how you're going to mitigate that over time. And you want to make sure you keep them abreast of those corrections until the item is closed out. They will most likely revisit your facility, so you want to make sure that you communicate with them on the entire process until it's closed. Reinspection of your facility, which they're likely to do if they give you a violation that needs to be corrected. They're authorized under FSMA to also collect fees for reinspection, which they may want to do. They generally don't, but it may be something that they are doing under the new regulation today. If there's technical issues or failure to comply with the standard of identity, this may not be material related, but they will also get back to you on that as well for reinspection. Some other inspection consequences for enforcement or criminal liability. Generally, they go after facilities if they find anything that may mitigate the corrective actions of the product as you state in your operations, or if you have an insanitary condition or pose a risk to the product. So handling that, they generally will come down hard with the 483 or may take something more seriously and force enforcement or closure of your facility. Generally, it leads to a recall and it creates a red flag in their system. And insanitary conditions can lead to administrative detention, recalls, or criminal prosecution. So something you need to be aware of today. They have much more higher authority. Administrative detention. There needs to be credible evidence that something is adulterated or misbranded in your facility. In the old days, they didn't have to. They did have to prove that something was serious to the health of the consumer. Today, they just need a reason to believe it's adulterous. And if in the old days, they never used this power, I can tell you, post FSMA, they've exercised this authority quite frequently. So they have shut down facilities and caused big name company recalls. Mandatory recall authority, as I mentioned, they can do this as well. It is always a good idea. If they cross this bridge, you want to do a voluntary recall yourself. It will save a lot of angst if you do this. But again, if there's reasonable probability, they will force a mandatory recall. You have a stepwise recourse if they pose a regulatory mandatory recall. Again, strongly advise you to do a voluntary one. If you refuse, the FDA can order a cease production of your facility. You have the right to a hearing within a couple of days. They can amend it as necessary, including an order for the recall to give consumer notice, so they can take it to the highest level, straight to the consumers, and they can impose fees for the mandatory recall, which they are likely to do if you refuse to voluntary recall. Fees, there's no fee for registration. They will likely post fees today for reinspection, or if there's recalls that are forced or made mandatory, as well as some other fees for importer voluntary qualified programs or importer reinspection. For 2019, in domestic fees are $253 an hour and $282 an hour for foreign travel. And reinspection only happens when an official action is indicated. So if something is non-compliant. There could be criminal liability today, which we mentioned. They have put people in jail for recalls or foodborne illnesses, and they hold what's called a strict liability. So if your leadership team of your organization is found to be criminally negligent, even if they did not know if something was going on in the facility or pose a risk to your products, they can be held with strict liability, and there could be criminal penalties for any of the management team that knowingly or unknowingly was involved with the foodborne illness. So corporate officers would fall under that. There's no requirement to understand that it was acted personally or there was wrongdoing or no knowledge of intent. If there is something that they feel is wrong, they will hold you to strict criminal liability and can impose jail time and fines. Now we're going to wrap up with some recent observations. And their calendar year for the FDA runs a little different than an annual calendar year. So one of the items that I want to discuss is their original intent for 2020. This is pre-pandemic. Some of the areas the FDA was focused on was to not only continue with enhanced GMP audits or full GMP audits. So this is more of the sanitary controls focus, but they were also expanding the preventative control focus. So anything risk mitigation under the new FSMA, they're doing more detailed audits for preventative controls today. So this is concentrating on 2020 on your allergen programs, your pathogens, food safety plans to control the risk. So this is a vital piece of the information they're looking at. And intentional adulteration, which went into effect of March of this year, is something they're looking to make sure you at least have a plan in place for intentional adulteration. You don't have to have it truly executed yet, but they want to ensure that you have a food defense plan in place for your facility. So that was another piece that they've added for this year. There's paying specific attention to sanitation, cross-contact and contamination in ready-to-eat raw foods, cross-contact due to allergens, training and documentation records, listeria and other pathogen controls, as well as zoning in ready-to-eat foods, and maintenance of equipment and facility infrastructure to prevent food safety risk. Always focused on unsanitary conditions, so that's something to keep in mind. They always have a inclination to looking at the basics, so something that they always examine during their inspection. So as I mentioned, their calendar year runs a little different under FDA. So the 2000 to 2019 observations for their top 483 violations or gaps that they found in your facility wrapped up in September of last year. There are updated pieces of information for 2020. It's an incomplete year. And because of the pandemic, I really did not include that because a lot of their inspections have been suspended, with the exception of a related recall or inspection that they've had to add. So the information for 2020 so far, I feel is severely skewed because of the pandemic. So I left it off with the most recent year, which ended in September of 2019. And you can see the number one issue found in their investigations are the lack of robust food safety plans. And that is the number one thing they're targeting as they come through for compliance under FSMA. So if your food safety plan is not controlling the risk in your facility or signed off by your PCQI or demonstrating risk mitigation throughout whatever your policies are, I can tell you will be written up for having an incomplete or a non-existing food safety plan. So that's something that folks should focus on. Personal practices. This is anything related to your GMPs of your employees, following good hand washing procedures, if they're wearing the proper PPE in your facility, if they're following the right SSOPs in your facility as they go through records review. So that's the second highest item that they're noting in their review of your people and also your policies in your facility. Pest activity or contamination, again, in sanitary conditions of your facility or not following good GMPs, again, is a high issue with them in their inspection because it's something that they've acquired a fondness for over the years in their inspection because it's an easy thing to cite as they come through and investigate or audit your facility. And to have these come up as a basic GMP issue in this day and age is really something pretty alarming for them. So they will definitely cite you. Sanitary monitoring. So are you handling your SSOPs properly? Are your employees doing the proper titrations for the chemicals in your facility? Are you monitoring the practices and swabbing and putting your mitigation in place to correctly mitigate your pathogen risks in your facility? Are you finding hotspots with your swabs? Are you controlling that through vectoring in your facility to make sure you're inspecting that properly and reducing the risk to your products? So these are items, again, that come up very high in their inspections. And sanitary operations, such as plant maintenance, may be inadequate. So this, again, is the infrastructure, the maintenance of your facility. Do you have cracked paint or peeling paint in your facility? Is your roof leaking? Do you have evidence of condensation in your facility? Is there spillage on the floor? Does your equipment look like it has rust on it or peeling paint on your equipment? Are your maintenance records up to date for calibration? Are you doing validation of your key pieces of equipment for calibration that are vital to risk mitigation or preventative controls of your facility? So these are the items that they're looking at, the top 5 for an inspection review when the FDA comes through. And I can tell you these are relatively the same over the last 3 years. These are the same 5 top items that come up. So these are the ones you want to concentrate on, and you want to periodically review. And I've put the web link on there to the website for the FDA. They publish these reports, and you might want to periodically review them to see what's going on in your particular commodity industry or sector of the food industry to see what, in fact, they're looking at as they're going through inspections for the facilities. And I'm assuming after the pandemic lockdowns are basically rolled back, the FDA will get back to doing these inspections, and we may get back to some semblance of normalcy as they come through your facilities. So something to be aware of. So some success takeaways for everybody. FDA FSMA really wants you to be audit ready today. And that, again, as I mentioned, is 24/7. You want to make sure that your regulatory inspection policy is in place, outlining the do's and don'ts for your facility on what is allowable or non-allowable as the FDA comes through your site. You want to make sure you review any significant plan changes in your facility that change a process or a line or something that's been added to your process or a formula change that's significant, and that has to be updated in your food safety plan to outline that for the FDA as far as risk mitigation. You want to make sure that your team members are well trained to deal with their level of expertise in your facility, and your PCQI is available whenever possible. Because it's a 24/7 operation, if the FDA comes in, and I'm assuming that most facilities run 2 to 3 shifts, it's a good idea to have multiple PCQIs trained in your facility as people do go on vacation or have sick leave. So you want to make sure that you're always prepared and have an adequate PCQI person on hand to answer questions with the FDA and also sign off on your weekly record requirements. And all the records that are critical to your operation have to be signed off on a weekly basis by your PCQI. You want to invest, if possible, in a good digital camera so you can take duplicate photos if they take some of your facility, which they most likely will do, especially if they swab. You want to make sure that there's senior management engagement and robust training of your employees, as well as detailed records to make sure that everything is up to date and that you're keeping track of employees' training to make sure if anybody misses training or is absent, or you rotate through different roles in your facility, that you capture all these employees and keep good records that they've redone their training and make sure they have all the adequate training as per your policies in your facility, such as allergen control or food safety training, and also the training for visitor inspections as well. You want to make sure that the facility has cross-functional leadership as they do the audit with the FDA, because many different people may be called in to give their piece of the requirement if asked questions. So it's not just a quality assurance or food safety responsibility that everybody shares in the roles during the audit. So if you have maintenance people doing calibration, if you have R&D people checking formulation or kill step validations or environmental swabbing, anybody that's required to do something that pertains to your food safety plan and your risk mitigation program is properly trained and is able to respond and share the burden during the audit while the FDA is on the site. So with that, I want to wrap up to see if there's any questions by anybody, and I'd be happy to answer them. I have my email here listed. I'd be happy to respond to any questions you may have. And with that, I hope that you enjoyed this presentation and that you're more prepared going forward to handle a new FDA FSMA audit in your facility. And I thank you very much for your time today.
And thank you, Gina Rio, for that look at the FDA FSMA audit. That concludes this presentation.